The crumpled flyer promised easy money for a 2-hour psychological study, but it delivered a chilling truth. My entire life had been a meticulously crafted lie, and my perception of reality was just the first domino to fall. My fingers traced the cheap paper, the edges already softening from being clutched so tightly. Participants needed for a 2-hour cognitive assessment, $1,000 compensation upon completion. No specialized knowledge required. The stark black text on plain white felt almost insulting in its simplicity, a stark contrast to the churning desperation in my gut. No company logo, no university crest, not even a contact name, just a phone number. Under any other circumstances, I'd have laughed and tossed it in the nearest recycling bin, but these weren't normal circumstances. My apartment in Riverdale felt less like a home and more like a sinking ship. The landlord's calls were incessant, the fridge a mournful cavern containing only a half-eaten jar of olives and a sad, shriveled apple. My last freelance design project had dissolved into thin air, leaving my bank account balance a figure that mocked me with its pathetic single digit. $1,000 for 2 hours. It screamed scam, yet the siren song of solvency was too loud to ignore. My thumb hovered over the phone icon, a battle raging between instinct and survival. Survival won. I dialed before my brain could fully register the decision. Prism Core Research, how may I assist you? The voice on the other end was unsettlingly smooth, female, and utterly devoid of inflection. It sounded less like a human and more like an advanced AI. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'm calling about the study, I managed, my voice a little rougher than I liked. The flyer for $1,000. Excellent, the voice replied, the word perfectly modulated. I'll need to ask a few preliminary questions to determine your eligibility. The questions were deceptively mundane. Age, general health, current medications, but then they shifted. Have you ever experienced episodes of derealization or depersonalization, a feeling that your surroundings aren't quite real or that you are disconnected from your own body? I hesitated. More often than I'd ever admitted to anyone. Moments where the world around me would subtly blur, or a familiar place would suddenly feel alien, as if viewed through a distorted lens. But no, I hadn't experienced them, had I? Just moments of intense introspection. No, I lied, the word tasting like ash. Do you ever find yourself perceiving patterns or details that others seem to miss in ordinary environments? Another pause. I often saw faces in wood grain or intricate designs in rust, more vivid than most. Not particularly, I lied again. And have you ever had the persistent sensation of being observed, even when alone? This one hit closer to home. A shiver that would crawl up my spine in an empty room. A feeling of eyes on me, even in solitude. Just typical paranoia, I suppose, I said, trying to sound dismissive. You qualify for participation, Mr. Vance, she stated, cutting through my half-truths. I blinked. How did you get my name? Your digital footprint is quite extensive, Mr. Vance. We prioritize discretion. Please record these coordinates. She rattled off a string of numbers that I furiously scribbled onto the back of the flyer. This location is within Blackwood Thicket. Please arrive promptly at 9:00 a.m. tomorrow morning. The session will conclude precisely 2 hours later. Do you have any further questions? I had a million, but only one found its way out. What exactly will I be doing? The lead researcher will provide full details upon your arrival. It is imperative that participants enter the assessment environment without preconceptions to ensure data purity. Her voice was unwavering. Before I could formulate another question, the line went dead. Sleep that night was a restless torment. The prospect of easy money warred with a growing sense of dread. Every creak of my old apartment building sounded ominous. Every shadow seemed to deepen and twist. When my alarm shrieked at 7:00 a.m., I slammed my palm down, silencing both it and my mounting anxieties. I needed that money. I really needed that money, my ancient sedan, the rust bucket, grumbled in protest as I navigated deeper into Blackwood Thicket. My phone's GPS, usually reliable, seemed to struggle here, its blue line wavering as if unsure of its own existence. The trees grew thicker, their gnarled branches weaving a canopy that choked out the morning light, plunging the road into perpetual twilight. The asphalt eventually disintegrated into a narrow dirt track, barely wide enough for my car, flanked by an oppressive wall of ancient, whispering pines. You have reached your destination, my GPS announced, its chipper tone a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom. All I saw were trees. I drove forward another 50 yards before the forest suddenly opened into an impossibly perfect circular clearing. In its center, stark and anachronistic, stood a structure that defied its surroundings. It was a monument to clinical modernity, a towering edifice of polished obsidian glass and seamless steel, gleaming in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the canopy. No signs, no logos, no indication of its purpose or ownership. Just a single imposing black door. I parked and approached cautiously, my heart thudding like a drum against my ribs. The door slid open silently as I neared, revealing a small, stark lobby. The walls were a blinding white, reflecting the harsh, unyielding light from unseen fixtures. The floor, a single sheet of polished gray stone, mirrored my tentative steps. Behind a desk of the same gray stone sat a woman. Her blonde hair was pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her pale skin, and her smile, as I entered, was a bizarre, unnatural rictus. Her lips pulled wide, but her eyes, a startling shade of ice blue, remained utterly flat, devoid of warmth or recognition. "Ethan Vance," she stated, not a question, but a pronouncement. "Right on time." Her movements as she rose were fluid, almost too graceful, as if rehearsed 1,000 times. She wore a tailored suit the color of storm clouds, not a single wrinkle marring its pristine surface. "I'll need you to complete these preliminary forms." She handed me a gleaming silver clipboard holding several pages of dense, minuscule text. I skimmed through, my eyes blurring over the boilerplate legalese. Standard liability waivers, confidentiality clauses, data usage agreements. Then a section snagged my attention, a knot tightening in my stomach. The participant acknowledges that subjective experiences during the assessment may include temporary alterations to perceived reality, including but not limited to visual or auditory phenomena, and are considered valid research data regardless of their correlation to objective reality. I looked up at her, a chill creeping up my spine. "What does this mean exactly? Alterations to perceived reality?" Her smile didn't waver. "Merely a standard clause for cognitive perception studies, Mr. Vance. The lead researcher can address any specific concerns upon your entry into the assessment chamber." I hesitated, the pen hovering over the signature line. The image of my empty refrigerator flashed behind my eyes. "The money," I signed. "Follow me, please." She led me down a hallway that stretched impossibly long, far beyond the physical dimensions of the building I'd seen from outside. The walls were still stark white, the lighting uniform, creating a disorienting, endless tunnel. We stopped at an unmarked door, which she opened with a swift, almost imperceptible flick of a black key card. "The lead researcher will be with you shortly." The room beyond was perfectly square, entirely oppressively white. White walls, white floor, white ceiling. The lighting was harsh, casting no shadows, making every surface gleam with an unsettling purity. In the center, a small, black table with 2 chairs stood like an island. I sat in one, my back ramrod straight, and waited minutes stretched, each one feeling like an hour. The silence in the room was absolute, so profound it hummed in my ears. Then the door opened. A man entered, tall and immaculately dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb all light. His face was handsome, but in an unsettling, almost inhuman way. His features were so perfectly symmetrical, so flawlessly proportioned, that they looked less like a person and more like a high-definition rendering. He moved with precise, calculated steps, each movement unnervingly deliberate. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice deep and clear, perfectly modulated. It was the voice from the phone call, somehow amplified, given physical form. "Just Ethan is fine," I managed, extending my hand. He looked at it momentarily, his gaze unreadable, before shaking it. His grip was firm but strangely cool, like polished stone. "I understand you have questions about our study." He took the seat across from me, his movements fluid and economical. "Yeah, like what exactly am I doing here?" He settled back, his hands clasped neatly on the table. "We are exploring the boundaries of human cognitive perception. Specifically, the mind's capacity to process anomalous stimuli and integrate multi-layered sensory input." His words were precise, almost clinical. "That's still pretty vague." A subtle, almost imperceptible curve touched his lips. "The efficacy of our research necessitates that participants enter the assessment environment without preconceptions, Ethan. I can assure you there will be no physical discomfort involved." He didn't promise no discomfort at all, I noted, a cold sliver of unease. "I'll need you to review and sign one final consent form." he slid a single sheet across the table. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the strangely cold paper, and read it more carefully than the previous forms. Most of it seemed standard, but one clause pulsed with an unnerving resonance. Participant acknowledges that perception is subjective and temporary alterations to perceived reality constitute no lasting harm. The participant further acknowledges that all memories, thoughts, and emotional responses generated or experienced within the assessment environment are considered property of Prism Core research. I frowned. What does this mean about temporary alterations to perceived reality? The researcher's expression remained perfectly neutral. Merely a legal precaution. Some cognitive exercises can cause brief disorientation, akin to an optical illusion. Nothing more. I hesitated, the pen hovering above the signature line. The gnawing image of my mounting debts pushed my hand downward. I signed. He retrieved the form, his movements economical, then placed a plain silver pen and a small, black notepad on the table between us. "Shall we begin?" The questions started innocuously enough. Basic biographical information, education, career history. Then they began to shift, veering into increasingly personal territory. "What is your earliest memory, Ethan?" Probably my 5th birthday. My mom made me a dinosaur cake. It was lopsided." He made a note. "And your most recurrent dream?" I shifted uncomfortably in the chair. "I sometimes dream I'm falling from a high place, just falling endlessly. When you fall, do you ever land?" "No, I always wake up before hitting the ground." "Interesting." He made another note. "What is your greatest fear?" I wanted to say something trivial, like spiders or public speaking, but what came out, startling even myself with its raw honesty, was being utterly alone, abandoned, forgotten. Like no one would even notice I was gone. I blinked, surprised by the candor. The researcher merely nodded, as if this was precisely what he expected. The questions continued, delving deeper, becoming more and more intimate with each answer. It felt as though I was willingly stripping away layers of myself I usually kept hidden, exposing raw nerves. Something about the researcher's unwavering, almost hypnotic stare made it impossible to lie, to deflect. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, he set his notepad aside. "We'll move to the next portion now." From a slim, black briefcase, he removed a series of cards. "I'm going to show you some images. Please tell me what you perceive." The first card contained the familiar black ink blot of a Rorschach test. I'd seen these in psychology textbooks before. "Two people facing each other," I said, a little too quickly. "Look closer," he instructed. I stared at the image again. My vision seemed to sharpen, and suddenly what had been two distinct figures began to shift. "They're not just facing each other," I murmured, a new, unsettling detail emerging. "They're the same person, looking at their reflection, but the reflection, it's slightly distorted, almost mocking." Where had that come from? I hadn't seen that at all at first glance, but now it seemed horrifyingly obvious. "Very good." The next card showed another ink blot, more abstract, a swirling vortex of black and gray. "A doorway," I said immediately, a strange certainty in my voice. "No, multiple doorways, all leading to different places. And something is watching from behind each one." My heart rate quickened slightly. I'd never been this imaginative with ink blots before. The room seemed to grow smaller. "What is watching?" the researcher asked, his voice a low hum. "I don't know, something that's always been there, observing, something that knows me." I struggled to breathe normally. With each card, my interpretations became more detailed, more personal, revealing thoughts and fears I'd never consciously acknowledged, never even had consciously acknowledged. The researcher showed no reaction, not even to my most disturbing interpretations. He simply nodded and made notes with his silver pen, the metallic scratch echoing in the silence. After the final card, he sat back slightly. The tension between us was palpable, as if the entire room had been imperceptibly tilting throughout our session and had now reached a critical, unstable angle. "We're ready to proceed to the next phase," the researcher said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Please close your eyes and count to 10 slowly." I hesitated, a profound chill running up my spine despite the room's comfortable temperature. Something felt profoundly, terribly wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. I had come this far. The money waited on the other side. I closed my eyes, the stark white of the room burning behind my eyelids. I opened my eyes and jerked backward in my chair, a strangled gasp escaping my throat. The room had completely, horrifyingly changed. Gone were the pristine white walls, replaced by grimy, peeling surfaces covered in brownish stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood, and patches of thick, black mold growing in the corners. The harsh fluorescent lights that had been almost painfully bright now flickered erratically, casting sickly yellow shadows that seemed to pulse and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. What the hell? I whispered, my hands gripping the edges of my chair until my knuckles were white. The researcher sat across from me, exactly as before, utterly unperturbed. Not a single hair out of place, his black suit still absorbing light in that strange, unnatural way. His expression remained perfectly neutral. "Is something amiss, Ethan?" he asked, his voice perfectly modulated, calm as a still pond. I gestured wildly around the room, my voice rising in a desperate plea. "The walls. Everything's different. What happened?" He tilted his head slightly, looking at me with what appeared to be mild curiosity. "I don't understand your concern. We are simply continuing with the assessment." My mouth went bone dry. Either he couldn't see what I was seeing, or he was gaslighting me in some elaborate, cruel psychological experiment. Neither option was comforting. "Let's proceed with the next series of images," he said, producing another stack of cards from his briefcase. I swallowed hard, trying to force my eyes to focus on the cards instead of the walls that seemed to be closing in, exhaling a faint, putrid odor I hadn't noticed before. The first card he placed before me was nothing like the neat ink blots from before. The image appeared to move and change, morphing from what looked like a screaming, contorted face into a writhing mass of limbs, then dissolving into a swirling vortex of shadow. "It's just a pattern," I told myself, my voice thin. "It's just an ink blot." "Tell me what you perceive," the researcher prompted, his gaze unwavering. "It's moving," I cried, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. "The image is moving. Interesting. Please describe the specifics." I forced myself to look again, my eyes burning, a face screaming, and then it changes into bodies. Twisted, broken bodies. The researcher nodded, making a note with his silver pen, which caught the flickering light momentarily, blinding me with an unnatural gleam. "Very good," he said, placing another card on the table. This one appeared completely blank to me, just a pristine white rectangle. I don't see anything," I said, a surge of relief, however brief. The researcher looked at the card, then at me. "You don't perceive the figure in the black suit standing directly behind you, Ethan." A sudden, bone-deep cold enveloped me. I whipped my head around, nearly tumbling off my chair, my muscles screaming. There was nothing there. Just the grimy, stained wall, its mold patches seemingly pulsing. When I turned back, the researcher was looking at me with that same clinical, detached interest. "There's no one there," I insisted, my voice tight with rising panic. "On the card, Marcus," he corrected, his voice a low, steady hum. "The figure is on the card." I looked down again. The card remained stubbornly, terrifyingly blank. "I don't see anything." He made another note. "Let us try another." The next card showed what looked like a car accident scene, complete with twisted metal, shattered glass, and what appeared to be dark, glistening blood. I blinked, and the image shifted, showing a different angle of the same scene, a child's toy peeking from under a crumpled fender. "This isn't an ink blot," I protested, my voice cracking. "This is a photograph. Why are you showing me this? Please describe what you perceive," he repeated, as if I hadn't spoken, his perfect features unmarred by my distress. "It's a car crash," I gasped, the air feeling suddenly thick, metallic. "It's graphic. Why are you showing me this?" The researcher wrote something down, his pen scratching against the paper. "Does it remind you of any personal experience?" "No," I said firmly, perhaps too firmly. "Are you quite certain? Nothing from your childhood, perhaps?" The question startled me, sending a jolt of icy fear through my veins. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 12. I had never mentioned this to anyone at Prism Core Research. How could he know? A chilling thought whispered in my mind. He knew before I walked in here. I felt something wet on my arm and looked down to see a dark, viscous red droplet, then another. I looked up and my breath hitched. What appeared to be blood was seeping through the ceiling directly above me, creating a slowly expanding, grotesque stain. The mold on the walls seemed to spread, reaching out like grasping fingers. "The ceiling is bleeding," I said, my voice barely audible as I pushed my chair back, a low growl of terror rising in my throat. The researcher didn't even glance up. "Tell me about your earliest childhood fear, Ethan." I stood up, nearly knocking over my chair, the metal scraping harshly against the floor. "I want to leave now. We have not completed the assessment, Ethan," he said calmly, his voice a velvet shroud that seemed to wrap around me, suffocating me. I struggled to breathe properly. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower, pressing down. Behind the researcher, I could have sworn I saw a shadow detach itself from the wall, moving independently, expanding, contracting, shifting into a formless, watching presence. "What's happening?" I demanded, my voice raw with terror. "What did you do to me?" "Everything is proceeding normally," the researcher replied, his voice distorted for a moment, echoing strangely as if coming from multiple points in the room simultaneously. "Please sit down." I backed toward what I thought was the door, but my hand met only cold, hard wall. The room's dimensions had changed, or I had become utterly disoriented. "Let me out," my voice cracked with raw panic. "We need to discuss your fear of abandonment further," the researcher said, standing up. He seemed taller now, his proportions subtly wrong, elongated, distorted. His head seemed too small for his impossibly long neck. "Your parents left you, didn't they? Everyone leaves eventually." My chest tightened painfully, a crushing weight in my lungs. I hadn't told him that either. "Stop it," I gasped, desperately backing away from him. 10, the researcher suddenly announced, his voice reverberating through the room, chilling me to the bone. "What? 9, he continued, his voice deepening, resonating with an unearthly echo. 8. The countdown sent a spike of pure, unadulterated terror through me. I didn't know what would happen when he reached 0, but every instinct screamed that I didn't want to find out. 7. The blood from the ceiling was dripping faster now, splattering onto the pristine black table, sizzling as if on a hot surface. The walls seemed to move in and out, the mold reaching, grasping. 6. I could feel a cold, immense presence directly behind me, and hear shallow, rasping breathing against my neck, a breath that smelled of rot and damp earth. 5. My vision blurred, the room swimming in a sickening kaleidoscope of black and red. 4. Desperate, terrified beyond rational thought, I lunged forward, slamming my forehead against the sharp edge of the table as hard as I could. Pain exploded through my skull, white-hot and blinding. 3. Darkness rushed in from the edges of my vision, consuming everything. 2. The last thing I saw was the researcher's impossibly perfect face, looking at me with that same detached interest, his eyes like twin pools of obsidian. 1. I collapsed to the floor. Pain pulsed behind my eyes, a dull, insistent throbbing that slowly dragged me back to consciousness. The fluorescent lights above me were agonizingly bright, forcing me to blink rapidly as my vision cleared. My forehead throbbed where it had connected with the table's edge, a burning knot of tenderness. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. When my vision finally focused, I found myself still seated in the same chair, at the same black table, in the same white room. But something was different. The walls were pristine and bright, no blood dripped from the ceiling, no mold grew in the corners, no shadows moved independently. The room was exactly as it had been when I first entered, clinically clean and blindingly white. The researcher sat across from me, his posture perfect, his black suit immaculate. He looked as though nothing unusual had occurred, as if the last 10 minutes had simply been a bad dream. "The first hour is complete, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice as measured and neutral as ever. "How are you?" tried to speak, but my mouth was bone dry, my throat rough. I swallowed hard, wincing at the soreness. "What happened?" I finally managed, my voice a croak. "You experienced a strong psychological response to the testing materials," he replied matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "This is not uncommon." I glanced wildly around the room again, searching for any trace of the horrors I'd witnessed, any lingering stain, any faint odor of decay. There was nothing, but the walls were, and the ceiling was. I gestured weakly, unable to articulate the impossible things I'd seen. "Perceived alterations to reality are a documented side effect of our cognitive assessment protocols," he said, as if reciting from a manual. "As stated in your consent forms." I looked at the clock on the wall. Exactly 1 hour had passed since we began. That couldn't be right. The nightmarish experience had felt like an eternity, a slow, agonizing descent into madness. "I don't understand," I said, pressing my palm against my throbbing forehead. The researcher stood with fluid precision and retrieved a crisp white envelope from his black briefcase. "Your compensation, as promised," he said, placing it on the table between us. "Thank you for your participation today, Mr. Vance. We found your responses most illuminating." I stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. It felt tainted, a price for my sanity. "The first hour has yielded valuable data," he continued. You are cordially invited to return for hour 2 at your convenience. The choice, of course, is entirely yours. My stomach lurched at the mention of hour 2. There was no way in hell. There's no way in hell I'm coming back here, I started, but was interrupted by a sudden wave of dizziness. The room spun, the white walls blurring for a moment. Take your time leaving the facility, the researcher said, seemingly oblivious to my distress. The effects typically subside within 24 hours. He moved toward the door with that same unnatural precision. Wait, I called after him, my voice raspy. What did you do to me? He paused at the doorway, turning to face me with that same neutral expression, those unsettlingly perfect features. We merely observed, Mr. Vance. What you experienced was already within you. With that cryptic statement, he exited, leaving me alone in the blindingly white room. I sat there for several minutes, the throbbing in my head a constant reminder, trying to gather enough strength to stand. When I finally did, my legs felt weak and unsteady, like a newborn foal's. I grabbed the envelope and shoved it into my jacket pocket without looking inside. The hallway outside seemed to stretch and contract as I made my way toward the exit, the white walls seeming to subtly pulse. The receptionist was gone, her desk empty. The entire building felt abandoned, a sterile mausoleum. I pushed through the front door, the obsidian glass sliding silently, and stumbled out into the sunlight. The fresh air hit my lungs like a physical shock, and the reality of what had happened, or what I thought had happened, crashed over me with brutal force. My knees buckled, and I barely made it to the edge of the woods before collapsing. My stomach heaved, and I vomited repeatedly until there was nothing left but bitter bile. Kneeling on the damp forest floor, I gasped for breath, tears streaming down my face from the sheer physical exertion. After my stomach settled, I leaned against the rough bark of an ancient oak and pulled out the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was cash, much more than I expected. I counted it twice to be sure, $2,000. Double the promised amount. There was also a small, elegantly typed note card, Hour 1 complete, return for Hour 2 at your discretion. I stuffed everything back into the envelope and pushed myself to my feet. The modern building stood silent behind me, gleaming in the afternoon sun, as if nothing sinister had ever occurred within its seamless walls. My car was where I'd left it, the only vehicle in the small clearing. I climbed in and drove away as fast as the dirt path would allow, watching the structure shrink in my rearview mirror until the ancient trees swallowed it completely. On the drive back to my apartment in Riverdale, every shadow on the road seemed to subtly change and move. Each passing car felt like it might be following me, its headlights like a predator's eyes. The sensation of being watched prickled at the back of my neck, making me check my mirrors obsessively. I cranked up the radio, hoping the blaring noise would drown out the rising cacophony of my thoughts, but the voices of the DJs occasionally seemed to distort, almost sounding like the researchers' carefully modulated tones. By the time I reached my apartment building, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice before managing to unlock the door. I rushed inside and secured every lock, then pulled all the blinds closed, plunging the living room into artificial twilight. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and finally looked at myself in the mirror. I looked terrible, pale, with dark circles under my bloodshot eyes. But there were no physical signs of trauma, no evidence of the mental torture I'd endured, beyond a small, tender purple bruise in the center of my forehead where I'd struck the table. I touched it gently, wincing at the tenderness. At least this was real, proof that something had happened. It was gaslighting, I told my reflection, my voice a desperate whisper, or some kind of hypnosis. Maybe they drugged me. The rational explanations felt hollow, thin, but I clung to them desperately. The alternative, that what I experienced was real, or that my mind had truly broken so completely, was too terrifying to contemplate. I fired up my old laptop and searched for Prism Core research. The results were sparse. A generic website with stock photos of smiling scientists and gleaming laboratories, vague descriptions of advancing human cognitive understanding, and a contact form that looked like it had never been used. No staff listings, no physical address, no history of published research. I tried different search terms: Prism Core psychological experiments, reality alteration research, hallucination studies compensation. Nothing useful came up. Hours passed as I fell down internet rabbit holes, looking for any information about the company or similar experiences. By the time I finally gave up, it was dark outside. The envelope sat on my kitchen table where I'd placed it, the cash inside still untouched. I couldn't bring myself to use the money, not yet. It felt tainted somehow, like accepting it would be acknowledging something I wasn't ready to face. Too wired to sleep, but too exhausted to continue researching, I collapsed onto my bed without even changing clothes. Despite my exhaustion, sleep came in fitful bursts, interrupted by vivid, horrifying nightmares. In one dream, the walls of my bedroom oozed the same brownish stains I'd seen in the assessment chamber. In another, I heard the researcher counting backward from 10, his voice seeming to come from inside my own head, chilling me to the marrow. I woke gasping for air sometime around 3 a.m., certain I'd seen a tall, dark figure standing in the corner of my bedroom. The room was empty, but the feeling of being observed lingered, a cold pressure on my skin. "There's nobody there," I whispered to myself, my voice cracking. "Get a grip, Ethan." I turned on every light in the apartment and sat on the couch until morning, jumping at every creak and settling noise from the building around me. When dawn finally broke, pale light filtering through my blinds, I felt hollowed out, utterly drained. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, and my mind felt foggy and disjointed. I shuffled to the kitchen for coffee and stopped short at the sight of the envelope. The money inside would solve my immediate financial problems. Pay my overdue rent, fill my refrigerator, keep me afloat until I found more freelance work. And yet, I couldn't shake the researcher's words, "Return for hour 2 at your discretion." As if there was any world in which I would voluntarily go back to that place after what happened. I poured myself coffee with shaking hands and stared at the envelope from across the kitchen. $2,000, twice what they promised. Why? The bruise on my forehead throbbed as a new, terrifying thought emerged. What if the extra money wasn't a bonus? What if it was an incentive to return? A hook to draw me back for more. For the first 3 days after my experience at Prism Corps, I didn't leave my apartment. I ordered delivery food, kept the blinds drawn, and jumped at every sound in the hallway. The bruise on my forehead faded from purple to a sickly yellow, the only physical evidence that anything had happened at all. The envelope with the $2,000 remained on my kitchen table, untouched. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the researcher's voice, that chilling invitation. I couldn't bring myself to spend the money, as if using it would somehow bind me to that place, acknowledge its terrifying reality. By the 4th day, rationality began to reassert itself, a thin, desperate whisper against the din of my fear. I needed to pay rent. I needed to eat. I reluctantly took $800 from the envelope and paid my landlord, leaving no explanation for my sudden solvency. The remaining $1,200 still sat, a malevolent presence, on my table a week after the experiment. I woke up at dawn from another nightmare. The researcher was counting backward from 10 in that perfectly modulated voice, and the walls of my bedroom had appeared to ripple and breathe during the dream, just like in that white room. I sat up, drenched in sweat, feeling a primal fear I hadn't known before. I made a decision. I needed to go back to Blackwood Thicket, not to participate in hour 2. I wasn't that desperate or that insane, but to confirm the building existed. To prove to myself I hadn't imagined everything. The morning was overcast as I drove, the rust bucket, along the same route I'd taken a week earlier. My phone's GPS, now strangely reliable, guided me down the increasingly narrow roads until trees crowded in on both sides, their branches scraping against the car's paint. My knuckles went white on the steering wheel as I approached the coordinates. "You have reached your destination," my phone announced. I slowed to a stop and looked around. Trees, nothing but trees. No clearing, no glass and steel building, no sign that anything had ever disturbed the natural growth of the forest. "That's impossible," I whispered, my voice barely audible above the rustle of leaves. I got out of the car and walked in circles around the area, pushing through underbrush, looking for any sign of recent construction or demolition. Nothing, not even a dirt path, let alone foundations or debris. I pulled out my phone and checked the GPS history, scrolling back to last week. There it was, the exact same coordinates recorded a week ago. I had been here. The building had existed, hadn't it? "Come on, Ethan," I muttered to myself, rubbing my temples. "You're not crazy." I took photos of the area from multiple angles, as if documenting the emptiness would somehow make sense of this impossibility. The entire drive home, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, unable to shake the feeling of being watched back at my apartment. I paced for an hour before collapsing onto my laptop. I needed information. Needed to know if anyone else had experienced what I had. I started with obvious searches, Prism Core Research, Psychological Experiment Hallucinations, Research Facility Disappears. The results were useless. Academic papers on hallucination studies, conspiracy theories about government experiments, fiction stories about mysterious facilities. Nothing that matched my terrifying, specific experience. I dug deeper, searching forums and message boards about strange experiences and unexplained phenomena. Most were filled with obvious fiction or the ramblings of people with genuine mental illness. I was about to give up when I found a link to a forum called Veil Breakers. The description read, "For those who have seen behind the veil, no judgment, no skepticism. Truth only." The forum was small, with only a few dozen active users. I created an account, Perception Drifter, and began reading through the threads. Most were vague, people describing strange occurrences or moments when reality seemed to glitch, but one thread caught my attention. The 2-hour test. The original post was from a user called Whisperwind. Has anyone else been recruited for a psychological study that offered $1,000 for 2 hours? The white room, the man in the black suit, the things you see in Hour 1 that can't be real. If you know what I'm talking about, please contact me. I need to know I'm not alone. I felt deeply unsettled as I scrolled through the responses. There were only 8, but each described elements of my experience. The ink blot cards that seemed to move, the walls that transformed, the sense that the researcher knew things he couldn't possibly know. One comment in particular stood out, from a user named Quantum Weaver. The 2 hours aren't consecutive. They're not even testing psychology. They're testing your ability to perceive multiple realities simultaneously. Hour 1 loosens your mind's grip on a single reality. Hour 2 is something else entirely. The administrators aren't human researchers. They're entities that exist between realities, studying our fear responses because they don't understand human emotion. Another user had replied, Reality Runner. I went back for Hour 2 3 weeks ago. I'll post a full account tomorrow after I've processed what happened. But there was no follow-up post. In fact, Reality Runner had never posted again. This pattern repeated with several users. They described completing Hour 1, mentioned plans to return for Hour 2, then disappeared from the forum entirely. Those who claimed to have refused Hour 2 reported increasingly severe reality slippages, describing exactly what I'd been experiencing. Walls that momentarily transformed to their nightmarish versions, shadows moving independently, voices that couldn't be there. I created a private message to Whisperwind, describing my experience in detail and asking if we could talk. To my surprise, I received a response within minutes. Not over the internet, they might be monitoring. Harbor Cafe tomorrow, 2 p.m. Ask for Lena. Come alone and don't bring any electronics. I stared at the message for a long time. Meeting a stranger based on an internet forum post about shared hallucinations seemed unwise at best. But the alternative, continuing to question my sanity without answers, seems worse. The following day, I left my phone and laptop in my apartment and walked the 6 blocks to Harbor Cafe, a small coffee shop overlooking the river. It was nearly empty on a weekday afternoon, the air thick with the smell of brewing coffee. I approached the counter and asked the barista, a young man with a tired face, if Lena was here. Corner booth, he said, nodding toward a woman sitting alone, her back to the wall, facing the door. Lena didn't match any mental image I'd formed. She was in her early 30s, with profound dark circles under her eyes like bruises and unwashed brown hair pulled back in a messy, desperate ponytail. Her clothes looked slept in, wrinkled and shapeless. Her hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she raised a coffee cup to her lips. Her eyes, a murky green, scanned the room constantly, darting between windows, doors, other patrons, as if seeking an unseen threat. "Lena," I asked, approaching her table, my voice hushed. Her eyes snapped to mine, assessing me with an almost feral intensity. "Sit down," she said, her voice hoarse, raspy, as if she hadn't used it in days. "And don't use my forum name out loud." Ever, I slid into the booth across from her. Up close, she looked worse, gaunt, with a grayish tinge to her skin that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too much fear. "Did you check for tracking devices?" she asked immediately, her eyes darting to my jacket. "What? No, They could have tagged you during Hour 1. They do that sometimes." She reached across the table, her fingers surprisingly cold and thin, and ran them along the collar of my jacket, then checked behind my ears with unnerving thoroughness. "I don't think I've been tagged," I said, pulling back slightly, unnerved by her touch. "You can't be sure." She sat back, apparently satisfied with her inspection. When did you do hour one? A week ago. She nodded slowly, a grim acceptance on her face. You're still in the early stages then. The slippages will get worse. Slippages, I repeated, the word tasting like lead. Between realities, the bleeding through. She took a long, shaky sip of coffee. It starts small. Things you see from the corner of your eye, walls that change for a split second, voices that seem to come from nowhere. Then it progresses. Full visual and auditory hallucinations, objects that move on their own. People with black eyes watching you from crowds. My stomach tightened into a painful knot. I had seen things, heard the researcher's voice. That was how it started. Lena's eyes moved to the door as it opened, tracking a young couple who entered, her head barely shifting. I did hour one 3 months ago. Now I see the other reality all the time, overlaid on this one. Sometimes I can't tell which is real. What is the other reality? I asked, leaning forward, my voice hushed. Not what reality. Realities, plural, infinite variations, all existing simultaneously, separated by barriers we're not supposed to perceive. She lowered her voice further, her words a frantic whisper. The administrators exist in the spaces between. They can see all realities at once, move between them. Our one is a test, to find people who can potentially do the same. I thought of the forum post that had suggested something similar. So this is recruitment, she nodded, a haunted look in her eyes. For some, for others, it's just experimentation. They want to understand how humans process reality shifts, how we break. Why me? Why any of us? You were marked, she said simply, her gaze suddenly intense. Long before you ever saw that flyer, they've been watching you for years. Probably your entire life. People who can potentially perceive multiple realities give off signals, I guess, neurological markers. The flyer was designed to draw you in specifically. It was a lure. I remembered how I'd been inexplicably drawn to that plain white flyer, how I'd kept it instead of throwing it away, how I'd called the number despite my misgivings. A chilling feeling of predestination settled over me. How do you know all this? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She laughed, a brittle, humorless sound. I've been researching since my experience, found others like us, and I've learned to see them sometimes. The administrators, moving through the world, observing. As she spoke, I noticed something disturbing. Her eyes seemed to flicker. The irises momentarily turning solid, obsidian black before returning to their murky green. She didn't seem aware it was happening. Lena, your eyes. They do that now, she said matter-of-factly, not looking at me but still scanning the room. Side effect of the slippage. I can see them more clearly. But it means they can see me too. I glanced around the cafe nervously. Are they watching us now? They're always watching. Once you've participated, you're interesting to them now. A specimen, she leaned forward suddenly, gripping my wrist with surprising strength, her fingers like iron bands. But there's someone who might be able to help. He used to work with them before he realized what they were doing to people like us. Who? She glanced around again, then slipped a folded piece of paper across the table, her movements swift and furtive. Don't look at this until you're alone, and don't tell anyone where you got it. They're watching, but they can't watch all the time. I took the paper and tucked it into my jacket pocket. What about hour two? All those people on the forum who went back, why did they stop posting? Lena's expression darkened, her face twisting into a mask of pure dread. Either they became like the administrators, or they couldn't handle what they saw, and she trailed off, dragging her finger across her throat in a grim, silent gesture. Hour two changes you permanently. The only question is how. Her eyes flickered to solid black again, longer this time, and she stiffened, her body going rigid. I need to go, she said suddenly, gathering her things with frantic speed. They're getting closer. Wait, I have more questions. The slippages will get worse, she repeated, standing up, her voice a desperate hiss. Much worse. Soon you won't be able to trust anything you see or hear. Get help before that happens. Before I could respond, she was walking rapidly toward the door, head down, weaving between tables with the practiced, almost mechanical movements of someone used to remaining unnoticed. She pushed through the door and disappeared into the street. I sat there for several minutes, trying to process everything she'd told me. Part of me wanted to dismiss her as delusional, a victim of her own unraveling mind. But too much of what she described matched my own experiences, and those eyes, turning completely black, that wasn't something someone could fake. I paid for her abandoned coffee and walked home slowly, hyper-aware of every person I passed. Did that man in the business suit pause too long when I walked by? Was the woman at the bus stop watching me specifically, or just looking in my direction? By the time I reached my apartment building, the sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows. I climbed the stairs to my floor, key already in hand. At my door I paused. Something felt wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, a primal alarm. I inserted the key slowly and turned it. The lock clicked and I pushed the door open cautiously. Nothing seemed immediately amiss. The lights were off, just as I'd left them. My laptop sat closed on the coffee table. But as I moved into the living room, subtle differences became apparent. The stack of mail I'd left on the kitchen counter was too neat, the envelopes too perfectly aligned. The couch cushions had been moved slightly, their creases subtly different. My jacket, which I'd thrown over a chair, was now hanging on the coat rack, perfectly straight. Someone had been in my apartment. Not a burglar, nothing was missing, nothing disturbed in an obvious way. But someone who had searched meticulously, thoroughly, and then tried to put everything back exactly as they'd found it. They'd almost succeeded. I checked the bedroom next. The same subtle signs of intrusion were present. Drawers closed too neatly, the bed made too perfectly. My entire apartment had been searched by someone very professional, very thorough. The envelope with the remaining cash was still on the table, untouched. Whatever they'd been looking for, it wasn't money. I suddenly remembered the note Lena had given me. I pulled it from my pocket and unfolded it with trembling fingers. Written in neat, precise handwriting was an address for the Riverdale Institute of Psychiatry, followed by a name, Professor Aris Thorne, specialist in anomalous perception. I stared at the note for a long time. A psychiatrist specializing in exactly what I was experiencing seemed too convenient, too perfect. But after what I just discovered, that someone had searched my apartment while I was out, I was running out of options. I needed answers, and Professor Thorne might be my only chance to get them before the slippages Lena described got worse. Before I could no longer trust my own perception of reality, I put the note back in my pocket and began methodically checking the apartment for surveillance devices. I didn't find any, but that didn't mean they weren't there. The administrators, whatever they were, seemed capable of far more subtle methods of observation. That night I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every distant siren or car alarm sent me bolt upright in bed. Twice I thought I saw the researcher standing in the corner of my bedroom, only to blink and find nothing there. The slippages were getting worse. Tomorrow I would visit Professor Aris Thorne and hope he could provide the answers Lena couldn't. The following morning, I stood at the bathroom sink, staring at my reflection. Dark circles had formed under my eyes from lack of sleep, and my skin looked pale, almost translucent. The bruise on my forehead had faded to a yellowish smudge, barely visible now. The physical evidence of my experience at Prism Core was disappearing, even as the mental effects intensified. I splashed cold water on my face and reached for a towel. When I looked up again, the mirror briefly showed the grimy, stained walls of that white room behind me, pulsing with unseen energies. I spun around, but saw only my bathroom wall, normal and unchanged. The slippage lasted less than a second, but it was enough to send a profound chill down my spine. Lena's warning repeated in my mind. The slippages will get worse, much worse. I needed answers before I completely lost my grip on reality. The note she'd given me felt heavy in my pocket as I pulled it out again, reading the address for the Riverdale Institute of Psychiatry and the name Professor Aris Thorne. Seeing a psychiatrist seemed like an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that what I'd experienced might be nothing more than a mental breakdown. But after finding evidence that someone had searched my apartment, I couldn't dismiss this as simple delusion. Something real was happening, something beyond my understanding, and Professor Thorne might be my only link to explanations. I caught the 10:15 a.m. bus to the Riverdale Institute of Psychiatry, a sprawling red-brick complex on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the sterile, institutional building I'd imagined, but rather looked like a renovated historical site, with manicured gardens and large, inviting windows. The main entrance faced a circular driveway lined with ornamental trees. At the reception desk, an older woman with kind gray hair looked up from her computer. "I have an appointment with Professor Aris Thorne," I lied, hoping a direct approach would work better than trying to explain my actual situation. She looked puzzled, tapping at her keyboard. "I don't see anything scheduled for a Mr. Vance. It might be under a referral from Lena," I said, taking a chance. The receptionist's expression changed, almost imperceptibly. Her eyes briefly seemed to lose their warmth, becoming flat and assessing, before quickly returning to normal. "Oh, I see. Professor Thorne does have an opening now. Second floor, East Wing, room 27B. He's expecting you. The ease with which I gained access made me deeply uneasy. Either Lena had somehow arranged this, or simply mentioning her name opened doors with alarming efficiency. Neither option seemed particularly reassuring. The hallways were quiet, with only occasional staff members passing by. Unlike the sterile white corridors of Prism Corps, these were painted in soft blues and greens, with framed artwork hung at regular intervals. Despite the calming decor, my anxiety increased with each step. Room 27B had a frosted glass door with Professor Aris Thorne, specialist in anomalous perception, stenciled in black letters. I knocked once and heard a muffled come in from the other side. Professor Thorne's office was nothing like the minimalist space where I'd met the administrator. Books covered nearly every available surface, stacked on shelves that reached the ceiling and piled on the floor in precarious towers. His desk was buried under papers, journals, and more books, many of them open to specific pages with sticky notes marking important sections. The man himself stood behind the desk, reviewing something in a thick, leather-bound binder. He was in his 50s, with distinguished gray-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He wore a rumpled white doctor's coat over a button-up shirt and a colorful, slightly askew tie, looking every inch the academic physician. "Ah, you must be Ethan Vance," he said, closing the binder and extending his hand. "I've been expecting you." I hesitated before shaking his hand, my suspicion immediately rising. "How did you know my name? I didn't give it to reception." He smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. It was a practiced, slightly weary smile. "Lena contacted me after your meeting. Please sit down." I remained standing. "What exactly did she tell you?" "Everything, I imagine." He gestured to one of two worn leather chairs facing his desk. "About your experience with Prism Corps, the White Room, the administrator, the reality slippages you've been experiencing since." Hearing him list these details so matter-of-factly was unsettling, stripping them of their terrifying, singular power. I slowly sat in the offered chair, keeping my back straight, ready to move if necessary. "So, you believe me?" I asked cautiously. "Of course," Professor Thorne said, taking his own seat, leaning back casually, his hands clasped over his stomach. "You're not the first person to come to me with this exact experience, not even the 10th. That caught me off guard. There have been that many, more than you'd imagine." He removed his glasses, cleaning them with a worn cloth from his pocket. "I've been documenting these cases for nearly 3 years now." I studied him carefully. There was something almost rehearsed about his casualness, as if he'd had this conversation many times before. "Who are they, Prism Corps?" "The administrator." "All of it?" I asked, my voice tight. Professor Thorne replaced his glasses and steepled his fingers. "They call themselves the Observers, though that's only one of many names they've used over the years. They're a research collective, investigating the boundaries of human consciousness, particularly our perception of reality. And the experiments, not experiments in the traditional sense," he corrected, a slight frown touching his brow. "Tests, more accurately. They're identifying individuals with specific neurological markers that make them sensitive to fluctuations in reality." That matched what Lena had told me. "The flyer, it was targeted somehow." "Precisely," Professor Thorne nodded. "They don't distribute those randomly. Something about you drew their attention. The vague wording, the unusual compensation, it's all designed to appeal to people with particular cognitive traits. People like us." I thought about how I'd kept that flyer despite its suspicious nature, how I'd called the number despite my misgivings, how it had seemed like a life raft in my sea of debt. "You said you worked with them," I prompted. "As a scientific consultant, yes," he sighed, removing his glasses again and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I was brought in to help analyze their data, to provide context for what they were observing. But I didn't fully understand what they were doing to participants until later." "And what exactly were they doing?" Professor Thorne leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, becoming more conspiratorial. "Testing your ability to perceive multiple realities simultaneously." Despite having heard similar explanations from Lena and hints from the forum posts, hearing it stated so definitively by a professional was jarring. "Multiple realities," I repeated flatly, my mind struggling to grasp the concept. "Current quantum theory suggests the existence of multiple dimensions, multiple versions of reality existing concurrently," he explained, gesturing to several thick books on quantum physics visible among the stacks. Most humans can only perceive one at a time, the reality their brain has evolved to process. But some individuals have the neurological architecture to potentially perceive more, to see the multiverse as it truly is. And that's what our one tests for, this potential. Exactly. Professor Thorne stood, moving to a crowded bookshelf and pulling down a thick, heavy volume. Our one isn't just testing your reactions. It's actively destabilizing the barriers in your mind that limit perception to a single reality. He flipped open the book to a marked page, showing what looked like complex brain scans. These are from previous participants. The left shows normal baseline function. The right shows the same brain after completing hour one. Note the unusual activity in the temporal and parietal regions. I glanced at the scans, but couldn't interpret the colorful patterns. So the hallucinations, the room changing, that was me seeing other realities. Overlapping realities, he corrected, his voice grave. What you experienced as deteriorating walls or inexplicable phenomena were glimpses of alternate versions of that space bleeding through as your perceptual barriers weakened. A chill ran through me as I remembered the blood dripping from the ceiling, the walls that seemed to breathe, the shifting shadow. That can't be real. It's as real as this office, Ethan, Professor Thorne said, his voice soft but firm. Just not observable to most people. I thought of Lena's eyes, turning black. And what happens if these barriers keep weakening? Professor Thorne's expression grew grim, shadowed. Without stabilization, your perception will continue to fracture. The slippages will increase in frequency and duration. Eventually, you won't be able to distinguish between realities at all. Your mind will become a sieve. Lena mentioned that. I swallowed hard, the taste of dust in my mouth. She said the only option was to go back for hour two, or seek treatment, Professor Thorne finished, his voice kind. Which is why she sent you to me. What kind of treatment? He returned to his desk and opened a drawer, removing a small, sleek metal case. I've developed a protocol that can reverse some of the perceptual changes induced by hour one. It's experimental, but I've had success with several patients. My suspicions spiked again. Why would he help people escape this process if he worked with them? Professor Thorne's expression hardened slightly, a fleeting shadow crossing his face. Because I discovered their methods were permanently damaging participants. The observers don't care about the humans they test, only the results. Those who complete hour two may gain stability, but they sacrifice something essential in the process. What do you mean? From what I've gathered, hour two binds participants to the observers in some way. Their perception stabilizes, but at the cost of their autonomy, their will. He set the metal case on the desk. It hummed faintly, as if alive. I left when I realized this. Now I try to help those caught in their web. I stared at the case, wondering what it contained, treatment or something else entirely. I still wasn't sure I could trust Professor Thorne, despite his seemingly straightforward explanations. So those are my only options: complete hour two and become one of them, or try your experimental treatment. There is a third option, he said, his voice low. Do nothing, and eventually lose your grip on all realities. It's not a fate I'd recommend. Before I could respond, a sharp, insistent knock came at the door. A nurse in blue scrubs poked her head in. Professor Thorne, there's an emergency with patient 17. They're requesting you immediately. He looked at his watch with concern. Tell them I'll be there in 2 minutes. The nurse nodded, her face tight with urgency, and disappeared. Professor Thorne turned back to me, an apologetic look on his face. I'm sorry, Ethan, but I need to handle this. It shouldn't take long. Please wait here. We have much more to discuss. He gestured vaguely to the bookshelves. Feel free to browse if you'd like. Some of those volumes might provide additional context for your situation. With that, he hurried out, closing the door behind him. Left alone in the cluttered office, I immediately stood and began examining the space more carefully. If Professor Thorne had truly worked with the observers, there might be evidence of that connection somewhere beyond his carefully constructed narrative. I moved to his desk first, careful not to disturb the papers too obviously. Most were academic articles about consciousness and perception, with titles like Quantum Observers and Conscious Collapse and Multiverse Theory in Neuroscience. Nothing immediately suspicious, but not exactly standard psychiatric literature either. On a side table behind the desk, nestled amongst a stack of folders, was a framed medical license for Aris Thorne, MD, PhD. I picked it up, examining it closely. The issue date was only 2 years ago, which seemed remarkably recent for someone his age. The seal looked slightly off-center, and the paper quality didn't quite match other medical licenses I'd seen. It felt too new. I set it down and moved to a filing cabinet, slightly ajar. Inside were folders with patient names, organized alphabetically. I found the V section and quickly flipped through, but there was no file for Vance Ethan. I checked the W section next, my heart pounding, and found a thin folder labeled Winters Lena. I hesitated, then pulled it out. The file contained only a single page, a transcript of a session from 3 months ago, around the time Lena said she'd done hour 1. The most disturbing part was Professor Thorne's assessment at the bottom. Subject continues to resist integration. Recommend increased monitoring and possible retrieval for hour 2 completion with or without consent. Reality perception deteriorating rapidly, making her a liability. Her connection to potential candidates remains valuable, however. I felt a cold dread wash over me. This didn't sound like the writing of someone trying to help Lena. It sounded exactly like someone working with the observers, tracking her for them. Lena's fragmented warnings suddenly clicked into place. I quickly replaced the file and continued searching. On a bookshelf behind his desk, hidden behind a large, ancient-looking globe, I found a series of unlabeled black binders. I pulled one out. It was heavy. I opened it to find pages of photographs and dossiers of people I didn't recognize. Each had a status marking, completed, in process, or resistant. Underneath, terse clinical notes. One photo showed a man, his eyes disturbingly blank, labeled completed assimilated. Another, a woman with a haunted stare, was marked in process stable but dissociating. Footsteps in the hallway made me quickly replace the binder and return to my chair, my hands clammy. The doorknob turned and Professor Thorne re-entered, looking slightly flustered. "Sorry about that interruption," he said, moving back to his desk. "Now, where were we?" I watched him carefully, my perception heightened by adrenaline and burgeoning suspicion. As he sat down, the lighting in the room shifted slightly, subtly, and for just a moment, a heartbeat, his eyes changed. The irises flickered to solid, obsidian black, just like Lena's had done in the cafe, before returning to normal. Only his lingered. The blackness held for a beat too long, an inhuman void staring back at me. I suddenly, sickeningly, realized the truth. Professor Thorne wasn't helping former test subjects. He was monitoring them, perhaps even retrieving them for the observers. Lena hadn't sent me here for help. She'd sent me here as a final, desperate test, a warning that I had just failed. I needed to leave. Immediately, actually, I just remembered an appointment, I said, standing up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I should go. Professor Thorne's expression barely changed, but I noticed his posture stiffen, becoming unnaturally rigid. "We haven't discussed your treatment options yet, Ethan. The slippages will only get worse without intervention." "I'll call to reschedule," I lied, already backing toward the door, my hand reaching for the doorknob behind me. He stood slowly, his movements fluid, unnervingly precise. "I'm afraid I must insist you stay, for your own safety." His voice had changed subtly, taking on that same measured, almost artificial quality I'd heard from the administrator at Prism Corps. The similarity was unmistakable now. It was the same voice. "I need to leave," I said firmly, my hand finding the doorknob, my fingers fumbling for purchase. "The observers have been waiting for you to come here," he said, his professional facade crumbling, revealing something ancient and cold beneath. "They knew you would seek help eventually. All the files I've shown you, the explanations, it was to gain your trust, to bring you back into the fold." My hand found the doorknob and I turned it, preparing to bolt. "Running won't help, Ethan," Professor Thorne said, his eyes flickering to solid black again, staying that way longer this time, the void staring back at me. "You've already begun the process. Without completion, your mind will fracture beyond repair." I yanked the door open and stumbled into the hallway. A security guard stood there, talking into his radio, but he looked at me with concern. "Sir is everything." I didn't wait for him to finish. I pushed past him, almost knocking him over, and ran toward the stairs, unwilling to risk the elevator. Behind me, I heard Professor Thorne call out to the guard, his voice perfectly calm, perfectly modulated. "Stop him, patient experiencing a psychotic episode." My footsteps sounded loudly in the stairwell as I took the steps 2 at a time, almost falling in my haste to reach the ground floor. When I burst through the exit door, I didn't stop to see if anyone was following. I ran across the hospital grounds, past startled visitors, toward the main road, not slowing until I reached a bus stop 2 blocks away. As I stood there, gasping for breath, my mind raced. Professor Thorne had confirmed much of what Lena told me, but he clearly wasn't the ally she thought he was. His black eyes marked him as someone already experiencing reality slippages, or perhaps someone who had completed Hour 2 and gained the ability to perceive multiple realities. Either way, I couldn't trust him, and I couldn't trust Lena either, not completely. For all I knew, she might have sent me to him deliberately, knowing exactly what he was, a final, desperate gambit. The bus arrived, its pneumatic hiss loud in the quiet afternoon, and I climbed aboard, taking a seat near the back where I could watch for pursuers. As we pulled away from the hospital, a profound sense of isolation settled over me. I had no one to turn to, no one who could help me navigate this impossible situation. The slippages would continue to worsen. Professor Thorne had confirmed that much, at least. And my options remained the same. Complete Hour 2 and potentially lose my autonomy to the observers, try an unproven treatment from someone I couldn't trust, who was clearly one of them, or do nothing and watch my grip on reality dissolve completely. As the bus carried me back toward my apartment, my thoughts spiraled. I wondered if I'd ever had any real choice at all, or if the observers had been subtly guiding me down this path my entire life. The bus ride back from the Riverdale Institute of Psychiatry felt endless. I kept checking over my shoulder, certain that Professor Thorne or someone else from the institute would be following me. My mind raced with everything I'd discovered. The patient file on Lena, those black binders categorizing people as completed, in process, or resistant, and most disturbing of all, the way Professor Thorne's eyes had flickered to solid black, just like Lena's had done at the cafe. By the time I reached my stop, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, unsettling shadows. I walked quickly to my apartment building, taking a circuitous route and doubling back several times to ensure I wasn't being followed. I unlocked my apartment door cautiously, half expecting to find someone waiting inside. The space was empty, but something immediately caught my eye. A white envelope sat in the center of my kitchen table, identical to the one that had contained my payment from Prism Corps. I hadn't left it there. I approached the table slowly, as if the envelope might somehow attack me. With trembling fingers, I picked it up. It was lightweight, containing something small inside. No name, no address, no markings of any kind, just like the first envelope. I tore it open and tipped the contents onto the table. A single, sleek silver key and a small card with GPS coordinates written in the same elegant typeface as the note that had accompanied my payment. The coordinates were the same location in Blackwood Thicket where the Prism Corps building had appeared and disappeared a week ago. The key was modern, likely electronic, with no identifying marks or numbers. I sat heavily in a kitchen chair, staring at these items. How had they gotten into my locked apartment? The implications were terrifying. Either someone had a key to my place, or the observers possessed abilities beyond normal human constraints. I considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I was being stalked by entities who could see multiple realities. That a psychiatrist with occasionally black eyes was working with them. That mysterious envelopes kept appearing in my locked apartment. They'd think I was having a psychotic break. Maybe I was. I put the key in my pocket and went to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. The face that stared back at me from the mirror looked haggard, with dark shadows under bloodshot eyes. I barely recognized myself. As I reached for a towel, the mirror's reflection changed. Instead of my bathroom wall, I saw the grimy, stained surface from the white room at Prism Corps, flickering with sickly yellow light. The transformation lasted only a second before returning to normal, but it was long enough to send me stumbling backward in shock. "It's not real," I whispered, but even as the words left my mouth, I watched the bathroom walls flicker and transform. Clean white paint became mold-spotted and discolored, then snapped back to normal. I retreated to my living room, but the phenomenon followed. The walls pulsed and changed, moving between my apartment and the nightmare version from Hour 1. The transitions were happening more frequently now, lasting longer each time. I grabbed my laptop, desperate for distraction, but when I opened it, the screen displayed a countdown timer, 10-9. 8, I slammed it shut and threw it aside, but the administrator's voice continued in my head, perfectly modulated and calm. 7-6-5. I pressed my hands against my ears, but it made no difference. The voice was coming from inside my mind, a chilling internal monologue. For 3-2, I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for whatever would happen at 0, but the countdown stopped abruptly, leaving me in intense silence, broken only by my ragged breathing. Night fell, and with it, my apartment transformed into a scene of changing horrors. Dark shapes moved across the floor, independent of any light source. They formed human-shaped outlines that stood watching me from corners, disappearing when I tried to look directly at them. I tried to sleep, but each time I closed my eyes, the countdown would begin again, jolting me back to terrified wakelessness. By 3 o'clock in the morning, I sat huddled on my couch with all the lights on, watching as reality fractured around me. The silver key and the coordinates card sat on the coffee table before me, a stark message, an invitation, or maybe a trap. By dawn, I knew I had no choice. The slippages were accelerating rapidly, just as Lena and Professor Thorne had warned. Soon, I wouldn't be able to distinguish reality at all. Whatever waited for me at those coordinates couldn't be worse than this slow, agonizing descent into madness. I showered and dressed mechanically, forcing myself to eat a piece of toast despite my churning stomach. As I moved around the apartment, the walls continued to change and transform, but I tried to ignore them, focusing on practical tasks instead. I grabbed my car keys and the silver key from the envelope, then hesitated. On impulse, I took the remaining cash from the Prism Core payment and shoved it in my pocket. Something told me I wouldn't be coming back to this apartment, regardless of what happened. The drive to Blackwood Thicket was surreal. The road occasionally rippled beneath my tires, like it was made of liquid rather than asphalt. Trees along the shoulder blurred and looked wrong, sometimes appearing charred and dead before returning to their normal green state. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, forcing myself to focus on the GPS directions. As I neared the coordinates, my heart sank. I expected to see only trees, as I had during my previous visit, but there it was. The glass and steel building, exactly as I remembered it, rising incongruously from the forest, gleaming in the pale morning light, as if it had never disappeared. I parked in the same small clearing and sat in my car, staring at the structure. Was it really there, or was this another slippage? Only one way to find out. The building's entrance was locked, but the silver key from the envelope slid smoothly into the reader beside the door. A soft click, and the obsidian door swung open into a darkened lobby. The receptionist's desk stood empty, computer screens dark, like dead eyes. The entire space felt abandoned, cold. My footsteps bounced off the polished stone walls as I crossed the lobby toward the hallway where I'd first met the administrator. I didn't need directions. My feet seemed to know exactly where to go, as if I'd walked this path countless times before. The white room was at the end of the corridor, its door slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, expecting to find the administrator waiting, but the room was empty, or almost empty. The black table was gone, replaced by a single, stark chair facing a large, blank monitor mounted on the wall. The chair sat in the center of the room, as if waiting for me. I approached cautiously. The monitor flickered to life as I neared, displaying a familiar face, the administrator perfect and immaculate as always. "Hello, Ethan," the recorded image said, his voice as smooth and neutral as I remembered. "I'm pleased you've returned." I glanced around the empty room, confirming I was alone, before sitting in the chair. "This is a recorded message, tailored to your specific circumstances," the administrator continued. "By now, you are experiencing significant reality slippages, moments when you perceive multiple realities simultaneously. This is not a malfunction or mental illness. It is the natural progression after hour one." I leaned forward, hanging on every word. "What you experienced during hour one was not an experiment in the traditional sense. It was an activation, a deliberate fracturing of the perceptual barriers that limit most humans to a single reality. This is a necessary first step in recruitment." "Recruitment," I whispered, the word tasting like ash. As if responding to my question, the administrator's image continued. "The organization you know as Prism Core is merely one front for our true collective, which we call the Quantum Weavers. We are individuals who have completed both hours of the process and developed the ability to perceive and navigate multiple realities simultaneously." The screen changed to show a simplified diagram of overlapping spheres, each labeled as a different reality layer. The universe, as most humans understand it, is merely one layer of an infinite multidimensional structure. Most minds cannot process this complexity and are locked into perceiving only one layer at a time. But certain individuals, like yourself, Ethan, possess the neurological architecture to perceive multiple layers simultaneously. We identify these individuals and offer them the choice to evolve beyond limited perception. The screen returned to the administrator. His perfect features held no judgment, only a clinical assessment. Hour 2 is not a continuation of testing, but a guided transformation. Those who complete it join our ranks with full awareness and control of their expanded perception. Those who refuse, he paused, his expression unchanging but somehow more severe, more final, eventually lose their grip on all realities as their minds attempt to process what they've experienced without proper training. They become anomalies. We clean up the anomalies. A cold, heavy weight settled in my stomach as I recognized the chilling truth in his words. The slippages were already overwhelming me. Without intervention, I would end up like Lena or worse. A broken mind adrift in a sea of impossible realities. You believe you discovered this choice through your own investigation, the administrator continued, his voice a steady drone. In reality, every step of your journey was anticipated and subtly guided. Professor Aris Thorne is one of our more recent recruits, assigned to monitor those who hesitate after hour 1 and direct them back to us when their symptoms become unmanageable. Lena Winters, unfortunately, was a failed integration. Her neurological markers were borderline, and her attempts to resist only accelerated her cognitive fragmentation. She was permitted to contact you as a final, desperate act, a final push towards your inevitable decision. Her warning was merely another facet of our guidance. The monitor changed again, displaying something that shocked me to my core. It was grainy footage of me as a child, no more than 7 years old, playing in a park. The camera zoomed in as I stopped suddenly and stared at something off-screen, something apparently invisible to the other children around me. More footage played. Me at 12, the day after my parents' funeral, waking up in the middle of the night and having a hushed, intense conversation with an empty chair. Me at 15, freezing during a math test and staring blankly at the classroom wall for nearly 2 minutes before continuing. Me at 22, walking through my college campus and abruptly changing direction for no apparent reason, avoiding the exact spot where, seconds later, a bicycle crashed into a lamppost. You have been observed throughout your life, Ethan, the administrator's voice explained over the footage, stripping away any sense of personal agency I'd ever possessed. These moments were tests, subtle manipulations of reality around you to gauge your unconscious awareness. You've always sensed things others couldn't, perceived shifts others missed. This is why you were selected. The footage stopped, returning to the administrator's perfect, unreadable face. Even the financial difficulties that made our offer so appealing were orchestrated to ensure your participation. Your entire life has been guided toward this moment of choice. My mind reeled with the implications. Nothing had been accidental. Nothing had been truly mine. My whole existence had been some kind of elaborate setup for this recruitment. A grand, horrifying puppet show, and I was the unwitting star. The choice remains yours, Ethan, the administrator said, his voice unwavering. Hour 2 awaits. Should you choose to proceed, you will join us with full awareness and control of your expanded perception. Or we can remove all memories of this experience, of Prism Core, the testing, and the subsequent events. Your reality slippages will cease. You will return to perceiving only one reality layer at a time, blissfully unaware of the true nature of existence, though you will forever remain unaware that your reality is being manipulated around you. The screen went dark, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of this impossible decision. I sat motionless, trying to process everything I'd learned. My life had never been my own. I'd been watched, tested, manipulated, a lab rat in an experiment I never consented to. Anger flared hot and sudden, a desperate, futile rage, but it quickly gave way to a deeper, more chilling realization. I'd always felt it, hadn't I? That sense of being observed, those moments when reality seemed to hiccup around me. I dismissed them as imagination or coincidence, but they were real. I'd been perceiving multiple realities my entire life, just not consciously. The door behind me opened. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. I could feel the administrator's presence, as distinctive as a sudden change in air pressure. "Have you reached a decision, Ethan?" he asked, his voice identical to the recording. I turned to face him, his figure looming in the pristine white room. "Did I ever really have a choice?" I asked, my voice raw. "Or was this always the only possible outcome?" "Choice is the one thing we cannot manipulate," he replied, stepping fully into the room. We can arrange circumstances, present options, even predict likely outcomes based on personality profiles. But the final decision must be genuinely yours. That is the foundation of our recruitment. And if I choose to forget, to go back to my normal life, we will remove all memories of Prism Core, the testing, and the subsequent events. Your reality slippages will cease. You will return to perceiving only one reality layer at a time. He paused, those black eyes fixed on me. But you will remain observable, and your potential will remain unrealized. I thought about my life before all this, struggling to pay rent, drifting between freelance jobs, feeling like something fundamental was missing, an ache in my soul. Had that emptiness been this unrealized potential, this awareness trying desperately to break through, and if I choose hour 2, what happens then? The administrator moved to stand beside the chair, his presence a cold pressure in the room. You will undergo a guided expansion of consciousness. Unlike the disorienting experience of hour 1, this process will teach you to control your perception, to navigate between realities deliberately rather than chaotically. You will join us as a trainee, learning to use your abilities under supervision. To what end? I asked. What do the quantum weavers actually do with these abilities? We maintain balance, he replied. Reality layers naturally influence each other. Without intervention, they would collapse into each other with catastrophic consequences. Some of us work to prevent this. Others pursue more self-interested applications of their abilities. So even among yourselves, there are factions. Politics, we remain entities, Ethan, despite our expanded perception. Power dynamics are inevitable. I looked around the white room, then back at the administrator. Lena said those who complete hour 2 either become like you, or they can't handle what they see. What did she mean by that? Not everyone adapts successfully to expanded perception. Those who cannot integrate the experience fully often suffer psychological fragmentation. His expression remained neutral. Lena's deterioration was unfortunate, but not unexpected. Her neurological markers were borderline acceptable for hour 1. Yours, however, are among the strongest we've observed in decades. Your likelihood of successful integration is very high. I stood up, needing to move, to think. The walls of the room flickered briefly, showing their decayed, blood-stained version before stabilizing back to pristine white. The slippages were accelerating. Your decision cannot be delayed much longer, the administrator noted, his voice a soft, persistent hum. He was right. Even now, shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move independently, forming shapes that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. Reality was breaking down around me, layer by terrible layer. I thought about my options. Forgetting everything would be easier. I could return to my normal life, blissfully unaware of multiple realities or the entities manipulating them. But I would be surrendering the truth for comfort, accepting a managed existence over an authentic one. Hour 2 meant venturing into unknown territory, transforming my consciousness permanently. It meant joining an organization with unclear motives and internal conflicts. But it also meant understanding, truly understanding the nature of reality in ways few humans ever could. I realized I'd always been searching for something beyond the visible world. That sense of something more had driven my curiosity and my willingness to take risks. Accepting the Prism Core experiment was even part of that search. I took a deep breath and faced the administrator. My decision was made. I want to know the truth, I said finally, my voice surprisingly steady. I want to see reality as it actually is, not how it's presented to me. I'll do hour 2. The administrator nodded once, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, as if he'd anticipated this choice all along. Very good, Ethan. We will begin immediately. He gestured toward the door, indicating I should follow him. As I walked out of the white room, my steps firm, I wondered if I would ever see the world the same way again. Whatever waited for me beyond that door would transform me permanently, for better or worse. But it would be my choice. Perhaps the first truly informed choice I'd ever made, and somehow that made all the difference. You made the right choice, Ethan, the administrator said, without turning around as we moved through the bright, white corridor. Few candidates possess your level of potential. I didn't respond. What was there to say? That I was terrified, that I still felt manipulated despite his assurances that my choice was genuine. That even now, as I walked these sterile corridors, the walls occasionally moved and changed before my eyes, revealing fleeting glimpses of another architecture, another dimension. We passed through sections of the building I hadn't seen during my first visit. The sleek, modern architecture gradually gave way to older construction, exposed, rough-hewn stone and weathered wood that seemed impossibly ancient compared to the building's seamless exterior. The deeper we went, the more I felt a strange pressure building in my skull, a subtle thrumming behind my eyes. The facility exists across multiple reality layers, the administrator explained, noticing my slight stumble, my momentary disorientation. What appears as a modern research center in your primary reality shows up differently in others. You're beginning to perceive these overlaps. I watched, mesmerized, as my hand passed through a patch of air that seemed to shimmer, to move, revealing a ghost-like outline of a different wall, older, crumbled. "Is this part of Hour 2 already?" I asked, my voice a little hoarse. "No, this is merely the continuation of your natural progression after Hour 1. The barriers in your mind are deteriorating rapidly. Your perception is already expanding." We stopped before a circular door made of some dark, unfamiliar metal. It had no visible handle or keypad, no discernible seam, yet it swung open silently at our approach, revealing a perfectly circular chamber beyond. 5 figures stood in a loose circle within the room, each identical to the administrator who had guided me here. The same immaculate black suits, the same unnaturally perfect posture, the same emotionless, symmetrical expressions. They turned in unison as we entered, their movements synchronized with unnerving, mechanical precision. "The candidate has consented," my administrator announced, his voice echoing slightly in the chamber. One of the others stepped forward, their perfectly sculpted face unreadable. "You understand that this process is irreversible, Ethan Vance. Your perception will be permanently altered. There is no going back to the limited awareness you once knew." "I understand," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, a strange calm settling over me. "Very well. Please stand in the center." I moved to the middle of the room. I noticed that the floor beneath my feet was engraved with intricate patterns, circles within circles, marked with symbols I didn't recognize. The walls were lined with mirrors, but they didn't reflect the room correctly. Each showed slightly different versions of the chamber, with subtle variations in lighting, furnishings, even the positions of the administrators. "Hour 1 fractured your perception," my administrator explained, joining the others to complete their unsettling circle around me. "Hour 2 will expand it in a controlled manner. Unlike your previous experience, you will be guided through the process. You will not be alone in the experience of multi-layered existence." "Will it hurt?" I asked, remembering the mental agony, the overwhelming fear of Hour 1. "Physical pain is irrelevant to the process," one of the administrators stated, their voice a collective hum. "Your consciousness will temporarily separate from bodily sensation." That wasn't exactly reassuring. The 6 administrators raised their hands in unison, palms facing inward toward me. The air in the room felt thick with pressure, building against my skin, a crushing weight that threatened to force the air from my lungs. "Close your eyes, Ethan," one said, their voice perfectly modulated, seemingly coming from everywhere at once, resonating directly inside my skull. "Focus on the sound of my voice. Allow it to be your anchor." I did as instructed, shutting my eyes against the increasingly strange distortions in the mirrors, the shifting walls I could still perceive through my eyelids. "Your consciousness is not limited to your physical body," the voice continued, smooth and unwavering. "It connects with all possible versions of reality. Most humans cannot perceive this connection. You are about to join those who can." A low, resonant buzzing sound filled the room, starting so low I felt it rather than heard it, a deep vibration in my bones. It gradually rose in pitch, intensifying, until it vibrated through every cell in my body, 1,000 tiny needles. The pressure against my skin increased, crushing me, until I struggled to breathe, my chest tight, my lungs screaming for air. "Do not resist," the voice instructed, now a commanding chorus. "Resistance creates friction between realities. Allow your consciousness to expand naturally." I tried to relax, to surrender to whatever was happening, but instinct fought against it, screaming for me to flee, to escape this overwhelming, invasive pressure. "Focus on my countdown, Ethan. 10. The administrator's voice, perfectly calm, anchored me as the buzzing intensified, becoming almost unbearable. 9. The pressure reached a point where I thought my skull might crack, my eardrums burst. 8. My breathing became shallow and rapid, a desperate pant. 7. The floor beneath my feet seemed to fall away, and I felt myself floating, untethered, gravity losing its hold. 6. The boundaries of my body began to blur, dissolving into a shimmering, diffuse mist. 5. I existed everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, a vast, formless awareness. 4. My perception expanded outward like ripples in a pond, encompassing everything and nothing. 3. Reality fractured into infinite variations, a kaleidoscope of impossibilities. 2. And then everything changed. 1. I was still standing in the circular chamber, eyes closed, the administrators around me. But I was also somewhere else, everywhere else. My awareness spread beyond my body, extending outward, perceiving multiple versions of reality simultaneously, effortlessly. I saw the chamber as it existed across different dimensions. In one, an ancient stone circle opened to the sky, mist swirling around crumbling monoliths. In another, a high-tech facility filled with gleaming equipment I couldn't comprehend, pulsing with alien light. And in yet another, a pure void with the 6 administrators floating in emptiness, their true forms shifting and unknowable. But it went beyond the immediate space. I perceived the entire building in its countless manifestations. A decaying ruin, a futuristic skyscraper, a living organism. The forest outside, a bustling city beyond, a desolate wasteland, all existing in countless variations, overlapping in shimmering, transparent layers. "Open your eyes, Ethan," the administrator instructed, their voice a chorus within my mind. I opened them to a world transformed, a tapestry of infinite possibility. The administrators still stood in their circle, but now I saw them as they truly were. Their human appearance was merely the most accessible version of entities that existed across multiple realities simultaneously. They shifted between shapes, sometimes appearing as the perfectly suited figures I recognized, sometimes as shimmering columns of pure light, sometimes as patterns too complex for my mind to fully comprehend, fractals of geometry and color that defied human logic. "This is overwhelming," I gasped, my voice sounding strange, distant in my own ears. "It will become manageable with training," one of them said, their voice a soothing hum. "Focus on maintaining your primary perceptual anchor. The reality you've always known. Use it as a reference point." I tried to concentrate on the physical chamber as I'd first seen it, the polished black table, the white walls, using it to anchor myself amid the flood of overlapping perceptions. Gradually, the chaos began to organize itself in my mind. The multiple versions of reality still existed, but they arranged themselves in layers, like a vast, transparent onion. I could focus on one layer, bringing it into sharp clarity, while maintaining a peripheral awareness of the others. "You're adapting quickly," an administrator noted. "Most candidates require more time to achieve perceptual stability." As my perception steadied, I began to notice something remarkable. Thin, shimmering filaments of energy connecting the various reality layers, like an intricate cosmic web. Places where the barriers between dimensions were naturally thin, porous. More surprising were the deliberate manipulations. Precise points where the administrators, or others like them, had carefully pushed one reality to influence another, or reinforced a boundary. "You're seeing the connections between realities," my original administrator said, stepping forward, his form momentarily coalescing into his familiar human shape. "The natural bridges and the constructed ones. You create these connections," I asked, watching a filament of energy pulsate, a vibrant blue between layers. "We maintain some, remove others, create new ones when necessary. This is our primary function, maintaining balance between realities that constantly threaten to collapse into each other." For what felt like hours, though time seemed strangely irrelevant in this expanded state, the administrators guided me through exercises to control my expanded perception. They taught me to focus on specific reality layers, to trace the connections between them, to recognize the signs of dangerous instability, like a tear in the fabric of existence. Gradually, I began to understand why Hour 1 had been so horrifying. The blood dripping from walls, the shadows moving independently, the monstrous transformations. These weren't hallucinations, but raw, unfiltered glimpses of other realities seeping into mine as my perception fractured. The terror had been necessary, a brutal shock to wrench my mind out of its lifelong belief in a single, fixed reality. "The process is complete," the administrator finally announced. "Your perceptual expansion has been successfully integrated." The circle of entities broke apart, and the intense pressure in the room dissipated. I felt myself settle back into my body, though my expanded awareness remained, a constant, humming presence. I was still Ethan Vance, but fundamentally, irrevocably changed. A human being who could perceive the multi-layered nature of existence. "How do you feel?" the administrator asked, his human form solidifying. "Different," I replied, struggling to find the right words. "More complete somehow, like I've been looking through a keyhole my entire life, and someone finally opened the door." He nodded, as if this was the answer he expected, as if he had heard it countless times before. "You will continue to process these changes for some time. The initial disorientation will fade as you learn to control your focus." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you begin your training as an observer." The administrator led me from the chamber, back through corridors that I now perceived in multiple manifestations simultaneously. It was disorienting to walk on floors that appeared solid in my primary reality, but existed as water, pure light, or nothing at all in others. We entered what appeared to be a conference room, or at least that was its manifestation in my primary reality. Around a long, sleek table sat several people who, like the administrators, changed fluidly between human appearances and more complex, abstract shapes. Unlike the administrators, however, these individuals displayed more variation, more personality in their appearances, their forms subtly unique. "These are senior observers," the administrator explained. "Not all of us maintain the uniformity that you've seen thus far. That is a choice made by those of us in administrative roles." A man who appeared to be in his 40s, with kind, tired eyes, stood and approached us. Unlike the others, his movements seemed more naturally human, though still with that slight, uncanny precision I'd noticed in the administrators. "This is Kale," my administrator said. "He will be your mentor during your training period." Kale extended his hand, a surprisingly normal gesture amidst all the strangeness. "Welcome, Ethan. The transition is disorienting, I know." I shook his hand, grateful for the human contact. "That's an understatement. I specialize in guiding new observers through their adaptation period," Kale explained, his grip firm. "You'll work with me daily until you've mastered the basics of controlled perception and cross-reality observation. How long does that usually take?" "It varies. Weeks, sometimes months. You're showing remarkable adaptation already, which is promising." The initial shock of my transformation began to fade, questions multiplied in my mind. What exactly do observers do? The administrator mentioned maintaining balance between realities, but what does that mean in practice? Kale gestured for me to take a seat at the table. "Our primary purpose is to monitor the boundaries between reality layers and prevent catastrophic collapses. When multiple realities occupy the same relative dimensional space, they naturally influence each other. Without intervention, they would eventually merge with disastrous consequences. So you're like reality maintenance workers." A subtle, knowing smile crossed Kale's face. "That's one way to put it. We observe points of instability and reinforce the boundaries when necessary, but there's more to it than that." "Manipulation," I guessed, remembering what the administrator had said about internal politics. Kale's expression grew more serious. "Yes, the ability to perceive multiple realities grants power. How that power is used varies greatly among our members. Some observers are purely focused on maintaining stability. Others explore the possibilities of influencing specific realities for various purposes, for their own ends." The administrator, who had remained silent during this exchange, spoke up, his voice resonating with an unyielding finality. "You will be assigned a specific territory to monitor alongside Kale. Your training will be practical as well as theoretical." "A territory. A designated section of overlapping realities," Kale explained. "Think of it as a geographic area that exists across all reality layers. You'll learn to monitor the boundaries within that space, identify potential instabilities, and eventually perform necessary adjustments. It's how you learn to see the cracks and how to mend them." It was overwhelming to consider, but something in me responded to the structured approach. After days of chaotic perceptual slippages, the promise of training and control was appealing, even a strange kind of comfort. "When do we start?" I asked. "Tomorrow," Kale said. "For now, you should return to your apartment and rest. The initial perceptual expansion is mentally exhausting, even if you don't feel it immediately." "I can go back to my normal life just like that." "Your life will never be normal again, Ethan." The administrator's expression remained neutral. "But yes, you may return to your residence. Your training schedule will accommodate your existing routines, for now." Kale added, "It's actually beneficial for new observers to maintain contact with their original reality layer. It helps anchor your perception during the adaptation period. The administrator handed me a small metallic device that resembled a business card. This will allow you to contact Kale or the facility when necessary. It works across all reality layers. I took it, feeling the weight of my new identity settling onto my shoulders. I had become something more than human. Or perhaps simply more aware of what being human truly meant. After final instructions from Kale about our meeting point for the next day, I was escorted back through the facility to the entrance. The forest outside looked exactly as it had when I arrived, yet completely different. I could now see the thin places where other realities bled through, the subtle distortions that had always existed but that my limited perception had filtered out. I drove back to Riverdale in a state of contemplative silence. The world around me was both known and utterly transformed. Cars passed on the highway, people walked on sidewalks, buildings stood solid against the sky, all ordinary scenes that now revealed their multi-layered nature. Behind everything I had always accepted as singular reality, I now perceived variations and alternatives, existing simultaneously in the same space. My apartment building looked the same as ever from the outside, but as I approached, I saw how it existed across multiple realities. In some, it was a crumbling, abandoned shell. In others, never built at all. In yet others, transformed into structures I couldn't comprehend, pulsing with unseen life. The version I had always known, the one in my primary reality layer, remained most solid to my perception, but the alternatives shimmered at the edges of my awareness, beckoning. Inside my apartment, everything appeared normal to ordinary perception, but I was no longer limited to ordinary perception. The walls occasionally revealed their alternates from other realities. Shadow figures, beings that existed primarily in adjacent reality layers, moved through spaces I had always thought empty, their forms fleeting, semi-transparent. I understood now why our one had been so terrifying. I had caught glimpses of these phenomena without context or control. I sat on my couch, watching reality change and flow around me. It was both beautiful and unsettling. Everything I had ever known was simultaneously more complex and more connected than I had imagined. My phone rang, pulling me from my thoughts. The caller ID showed unknown, but somehow I knew who it was. "Hello, Kale," I answered. "Good, your perception is already sharpening," he replied. "How are you adjusting? It's a lot to process." "That's to be expected. Try to get some rest. Focus on your primary reality layer when the overlaps become too disorienting. I'll meet you tomorrow at 9 a.m. at the Daily Grind Cafe, 3 blocks from your apartment, not at the facility. We'll be working in the field. Your assigned territory includes parts of Riverdale, including your apartment building. Better to start directly in situ." After he hung up, I walked through my apartment, testing my new perception. I found I could control the intensity of the overlap somewhat by concentrating. When I focused on my primary reality layer, the alternatives receded to the periphery of my awareness, becoming faint whispers. When I relaxed that focus, the multiple versions became equally present, vibrant and compelling. That night, I lay in bed watching shadows move across my ceiling. Not the ordinary shadows cast by street lights, but entities that existed primarily in adjacent realities, their presence barely registering in mine. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt a strange calm, an odd acceptance. These phenomena had always been there, I just hadn't been able to see them. Sleep came surprisingly easily, deep and dreamless, perhaps because for the first time in days I wasn't fighting to make sense of my fragmented perception. The expansion was complete. The integration begun. I woke at dawn, feeling more rested than I had since hour one. My expanded perception remained, but the initial disorientation had faded considerably. I could move through my apartment, preparing for the day, while maintaining awareness of the reality overlaps without becoming distracted by them. As I dressed, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked the same, exactly the same, and yet somehow fundamentally changed. It wasn't anything visible. It was something in my eyes, a depth of awareness that hadn't been there before. "Still me," I told my reflection. Just more, at precisely 9 a.m., I entered the Daily Grind Cafe where Kale waited. He sat at a corner table, dressed in business casual rather than the formal suits favored by the administrators. Like them, he maintained perfect posture, but his movements seemed more naturally human, deliberate rather than mechanically precise. "Good morning, Ethan," he said as I approached. "How was your first night with expanded perception?" Better than I expected, I sat across from him. I thought I'd be up all night seeing things move in the dark. He smiled slightly. The human mind is remarkably adaptable, yours especially so. The initial reports from your hour one were impressive. Reports? I raised an eyebrow. You've been watching me since then. Of course, all candidates are observed between hours. It's part of the pre-integration phase. I thought about the days after hour one, my desperate research, meeting Lena, visiting Professor Thorne. So you know about my investigation? Yes, including your meeting with Lena Winters and your visit to Professor Aris Thorne. Cale sipped his coffee. Your resourcefulness was noted. So was your determination to understand what was happening to you. Those qualities are valuable in an observer. And Lena, is she being helped at all? Cale's expression grew serious, his gaze distant. Lena Winters represents a complicated case. Her neurological markers were borderline acceptable for hour one. She was never intended to proceed to hour two. So you just let her suffer through reality slippages that get progressively worse. Intervention has been attempted. She's rejected it thus far. He paused, his eyes meeting mine. Not everyone who experiences hour one can adapt successfully, Ethan. Some refuse the help we offer, clinging to a limited perception even as it unravels around them. And Professor Thorne, what's his role in all this? Professor Thorne completed both hours approximately 2 years ago. He serves as a monitoring agent for candidates who attempt to seek external help after hour one. He reports directly to the administrators. I recalled the file I'd found in Thorne's office, his chilling assessment of Lena. He's not trying to help people like Lena at all, is he? His primary function is observation, not intervention. Cale's tone remained neutral, unjudging. You'll come to understand that the relationship between observers and candidates is more complex than it might initially appear. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. So what's my first lesson? Perception control in dynamic environments. He gestured around the cafe. Tell me what you see, not in your primary reality layer, but in the alternatives. I looked around, allowing my focus to shift from my primary reality. The cafe transformed in my perception. In one reality layer, it was abandoned, dust covering tables and chairs, cobwebs clinging to the windows. In another, it was a completely different business, a bustling bookstore with shelves where counters should be, patrons browsing titles I couldn't quite read. In yet another, the space didn't exist at all, replaced by an empty lot visible through a kind of perceptual translucence, a gaping hole in the fabric of existence. It's different in every reality, I said, a strange sense of awe washing over me. Abandoned in one, a bookstore in another, not even here in a third. Cale nodded approvingly. Good. You're perceiving clearly without losing your anchor to your primary reality. Now, look at the people. I shifted my focus to the handful of customers scattered around the cafe. Unlike the environment, which maintained a relatively stable form in each reality layer, the people were more complex. Some existed in multiple realities simultaneously, slightly different versions of themselves overlapping like double-exposed photographs. Others appeared in only one reality, absent entirely from others. Some exist across multiple realities, others don't, I observed. The ones who exist in multiple realities look almost the same, but with small differences. Those are versions of the same individual across reality layers, Cale explained. The more realities a person exists in simultaneously, the stronger their impact on the multiverse structure. And those who only exist in one reality, specific manifestations, their existence doesn't extend beyond a single layer. He pointed subtly toward a barista behind the counter, a young man with a bright, easy smile. Now, observe him carefully. Tell me what you see. I focused on the young man making coffee. At first, he appeared normal, existing primarily in my reality layer, with shadowy, ghost-like versions in a few adjacent ones. But as I watched more closely, I noticed something unusual. Thin filaments of energy, shimmering like spider silk, connecting him to specific points in the cafe, the counter, a support beam, a particular booth. Almost like invisible threads anchoring him to the space. He has connections, I said, struggling to find the right words, like tethers to specific points in this reality. Cale smiled, a genuine, warm expression that momentarily dispelled the clinical veneer of his profession. Very good, you're seeing a stabilization node. A person whose presence helps maintain reality consistency in this location. Some humans naturally serve this function without knowing it. Their routine presence reinforces reality boundaries. For the next 2 hours, Daniel guided me through increasingly complex perceptual exercises. He taught me to identify different types of connections between realities, the natural ones, the manipulated ones, the weak spots. He showed me how to recognize potential points of instability, like a ripple in the fabric of existence that could grow into a tear. He even taught me to track the movement of entities that existed primarily between reality layers rather than within them, the shadowy figures I'd glimpsed in my apartment. By the time we finished, my head was buzzing with new information, but I felt more in control of my expanded perception than I had since the process began. "You're progressing faster than expected," Cale said as we left the cafe. "Tomorrow we'll begin work on your assigned territory, the eastern section of Riverdale, including your apartment building." "My building is in my territory?" I asked, surprised. "Yes, that's intentional. New observers typically monitor the areas they're already familiar with. Your existing knowledge of the primary reality layer provides a solid foundation." As we walked down the street, I noticed how differently I now perceived the world around me. The multiple reality layers no longer felt chaotic or overwhelming. They had structure, patterns I was beginning to recognize. "Cale," I said, stopping at a corner, "what made you decide to become an observer?" He considered the question carefully, looking up at the overcast sky. I didn't see it as a decision so much as an acceptance of what I already was. Like you, I had always sensed things others couldn't. The opportunity to understand those perceptions, to give them context and purpose, that was what appealed to me. "And do you have any regrets?" He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a flicker of something profound in his eyes. "Knowledge always comes at a cost, Ethan. The question is whether the price is worth what you gain." He paused. "For me, it was. I believe it will be for you as well." We parted ways at the intersection, with instructions to meet again the following morning. I continued toward my apartment, my mind filled with everything I'd learned and everything I still needed to understand. The world around me was transformed, not physically, but in my perception of it. I now saw the reality I had always known as just one layer among many, all existing simultaneously in the same space. The buildings, streets, and people I passed were both exactly what they had always been, and infinitely more complex than I had ever imagined. I had begun a journey into understanding the true nature of reality, a journey that had only just started. The uncertainty of what lay ahead was balanced by the wonder of what I could already perceive, and the promise of greater understanding to come. As I reached my apartment building, I paused to look back at the city stretching out before me, a swirling nexus of countless realities. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I had made the right choice. Whatever challenges awaited me as an observer, whatever politics and complexities existed within their ranks, I could never have returned to the limited perception I'd known before. And as I stepped inside, the walls of my apartment flickered, revealing the ghost of other versions, other lives, and a chilling thought settled deep in my mind. I was still Ethan Vance, but fundamentally changed. A human being who could perceive the multi-layered nature of existence. Or was I merely a new anchor, a new tool for the quantum weavers, my purpose now defined by a consciousness far older and colder than my own? What would you have chosen in Ethan's place? Let me know in the comments.